Well, tonight we are in part 3 of a message series titled The Waiting Room. I know last week didn't count. Part 3 of a message series titled The Waiting Room. And here's what we've been doing this series. We've been exploring how God works in our lives during times when it feels like heaven has gone silent. And the big idea of this series is this. I think for everybody in here, every single one of you, you got some desires, you got some goals, you got some things you're hoping God's going to do in your life in the next few months, next few years, some of you guys in the next few days, right? You guys all have desires. And the big idea with this series is that rarely will God take you directly to your final destination. Oftentimes, in the process of God trying to take you to where it is you desire to go or where he's taking you, you'll experience detours or delays or what we've been describing as waiting rooms. And so far with this series, we've made the point that when you experience delays or detours or you find yourself in waiting rooms in your life, that it's not always a bad thing. In fact, we've made the point that God will sometimes use those waiting rooms as resource or classrooms where he equips you and resources you with the tools and the giftings and the experiences you will need to excel when you finally get to where he's taking you. And that's really the big idea with the series. Now, so far in this series, we've looked at really 2 messages. I mean, we looked at 3, but we looked at 2 messages where we've studied the life of Noah, right? Dude in the Old Testament who was like 500 years old before he had his first kiss. We've looked at the story of the book of Acts, the early church, as they were waiting for God, right? And in both cases, if you recall those stories, both of those cases, their waiting rooms were a result of God's direct intervention. God literally said, y'all need to wait till I'm done doing what I'm going to do. Well, tonight, I want to talk about those waiting rooms in your life that come as a result of what I describe as user error. I want to talk about those waiting rooms that you and I will sometimes experience that come as a result of user error. And to do so, I want to walk through a life of the guy in the Old Testament named Joseph. How many of you guys know the guy named Joseph? Ever heard the story of Joseph? Oh, this is going to be awesome. If you don't know him, it's going to be awesome. You'll find out about him in a minute. But what I want to do tonight, though, I don't want to do an exhaustive or even comprehensive study on his life because that could take forever. Instead, what I'm going to do is a flyby, right? As opposed to being on a taxi cab going through every corner of his life, I'm going to do a flyby and do sort of an overview of his life. And the reason I'm doing so is because in 2 weeks, we're going to start a brand new message series. Where's Kelsey? You're going to hit those lights. Or Andrew, you're good. Because in 2 weeks, man, I am so super pumped about this. We are going to do a brand new message series. Well, tell you what, let me just show you the video. Excitement. Spent all week looking for that beat. I'm like, we can just listen to that song the whole series. I was so excited about that. But no, for real though, we are going to be studying Joseph, or as I like to call him, Joe. It's going to be awesome. I'm sure Bible will allow me a lot of room to call him that. And man, I got to tell you, I've been looking forward to teaching about the life of Joseph for 3 years. I mean, since I was in seminary, I read a book about him and I thought, man, and here's what's crazy about the series. Till this moment, every time I read through the story of Joseph from Genesis 37 to 50, I believe those are the chapters, I don't know why, but I weep like a little girl. It's a really, really good story. I go home, my wife is like, really? Again? Crying? No, she doesn't. She hugs me. She's like, it's okay, sweetie, I love you. But now we're going to follow in Joseph's footstep and explore his remarkable journey from simple dude next door to the second most powerful man in the greatest nation at the time. And I'm so excited about this because I am convinced that many of your lives will take that same trajectory. Right now, you might be the average Joe or Jen or Jane. I'm making that official. Average Jen. Right? That might be you, right? But in the next few years, man, God will take you through something. And here's what's crazy about Joe's life. you'll find out that he didn't just go literally from dude next door to prime minister, but in between, boy, there were some serious waiting rooms that he had to experience. And in fact, tonight I want to give you cliff notes, right? Cliff notes of his story and focus on some very practical lessons. So once again, I'm not going to go into every detail about Joseph's life, just give you big overview. So let's jump right into it with the first point, all right? Get your pens, get your paper. Here we go. First point is this. Some waiting rooms, all right, I've already explained what waiting rooms are. There are delays and detours that we sometimes experience. Some waiting rooms in our lives are a result of personal, foolish actions. Personal, foolish actions. Man, I could imagine most of you guys just went, oh man, really? So, I'm not going to go verse by verse, right, because we're going to spend a whole series, I don't know, maybe 6, 7, however long. But when we meet Joseph in Genesis 37, the first time you meet him in Genesis 37, it leaves you with the strong impression that this, by the way, he's 17 years old when we meet him. When you first meet him, you're left with a very strong impression that he was a little bit of an arrogant daddy's boy. In fact, the very first introduction we're told about Joseph, who was the son of Jacob, is this. It says he had 11 brothers, actually 12 brothers, I think, 11 brothers. And it says he brought a bad report about them to his father. Really? Whiny dude? You gonna rat on your bros? Seriously? Right? So, of course, the very first time we meet him, he's ratting on his brothers. So we know going into the story, his brothers don't like him, right? We can't stand this kid. But then the next verse says something else. It says not only did his brothers kind of, but he was daddy's favorite boy. In fact, the account says daddy bought for him a very special coat. Like a luxurious, I don't know if that's a right word, like a very fancy coat, right? Got him a nice leather jacket, right? Got him some leather jacket of their time, right? And so not only is Joseph a little bit arrogant, his father's adding to that by saying, hey, you guys remember my son who you guys don't like? Yeah, I like him the most, right? So he's putting him out there, right? As if that were not enough, God reveals to Joseph early on in his life in a dream that he's someday going to be this great guy. And what does Joe do? Instead of keeping it to himself and trusting God for it, what does he do? He gets his 11 brothers together and tells them, hey, God showed me I'm going to be greater than you guys, right? On top of that, he gets his parents involved. He says, listen, I don't mean to brag or nothing, but God showed me that I'm even going to be greater than you too, Dad and Mom. This is Joe, early on in life, 17 years old. Of course, this is not working out right. I think it's fair to say some of his actions at 17 years old were foolish. How many of you guys would describe year 17 in your life as foolish? All right, I think a few of you guys can identify. The rest of you guys are lying, but anyway, I'm just kidding. So here we are. So at this point, the brothers, right, they are so peeved off at him that they're literally starting to plan murder. I mean, that's the level of hatred that's going on. It's just a dysfunctional family. If you come from a dysfunctional family, you're going to love this story, right? Because they're starting to plan evil against him. Now, and I'll flesh this out in the series, but by no means am I justifying what the brothers are going to do to him next, nor am I implying that what Joseph did is so bad to invite what the brothers are going to do next. However, Joseph's immaturity in this story I just shared contributed to their growing anger towards him, his foolishness. In fact, the fact that his father kept putting him above the rest of them sort of contributed to the foolishness, right? And so his brothers get so tired of him that literally they conspire to kill him. Let's get rid of him. They want to kill him. But actually, right as they're about to carry out their plan, they're talked out of it by the oldest brother, a guy you'll meet named Reuben. And instead of killing him, they decide, you know what, let's make some money off this dude. Let's sell him into slavery. And so what I think perhaps innocently began as foolish actions at the beginning of Joseph's life ends up costing him a lot more than he planned to pay. Let me ask you this. How many of you guys have ever been, in honesty time, okay? All right, this is not church people. This is real, right? How many of you have ever engaged in any kind of foolish activity that resulted in a major or even minor setback in your life? Yeah, right? How many of you guys have ever engaged in an event when a reaction to your foolish reaction was disproportionate. So you did something that you thought to yourself, oh, it's not that bad, and all of a sudden you get this huge backlash, right? Some of you guys have been there, right? I appreciate the honesty. You know, I think you and I, many times, we sometimes throw questions at God. Like, why are you making me wait so long? And why am I having to wait so long? But, you know, can we just be honest to one another and say there are certain waiting rooms in our lives that we find ourselves in as a result of our foolish action? There's some waiting rooms you'll find yourselves in as a result of other people's foolish actions, right? As far as my life, in 1988, my life took a dramatic, significant detour when I foolishly agreed with some of my dumb friends in Nicholas Orem Middle School in Maryland, Hyattsville, Maryland is where I was living at the time. I agreed with some of my dumb friends to play hooky and skip class. That plan lasted for about 5 minutes. School monitor caught us, took us, for all three of us, to the principal's office. We get in there, and principal is just ticked off. Two of the guys get suspension. Two of them get detention. One of them gets a suspension. I get expelled. Now, let me give you some context. Prior to that event, I had accumulated a series of shortcomings before my principal. You know, for me, just so you understand why it was so bad for me, I had done a bunch of dumb things before, and she had just had enough of me. Man, they didn't even wait for my parents to come. They just told me to pack my bags and go home. And I was expelled out of junior high so you didn't know this about me. I was expelled out of junior high in 1988. Now, I was living in Maryland at the time with my uncle because my parents were traveling. Well, as a result of, think about what I did. I just decided to play hooky with some of my friends. As a result of that, my uncle immediately put me on a plane back to Nigeria. I got to Nigeria. I immediately went to a boarding school in the heartland of Nigeria. The most difficult transition in my life I've ever experienced. I just skipped class. And I ended up in Africa. You're like, what? Where did that come from, right? But boy, I mean, you know what? That's the same thing many people go through, right? I just took one piece of candy, right? Or I didn't, you're right? There are some waiting rooms that you and I will find ourselves in as a result of some foolish actions, all right? And I think sometimes it might be cathartic. It might be helpful for some of us, not all of us, right? Because some of you guys are going through some waiting periods in your life that's not really a result of you. Some of you guys honestly have not done anything wrong. And we'll see that in Joseph's life when we get to that series where Joseph gets in trouble when he does right. I'm sorry, he gets in trouble when he does wrong, but he also gets in trouble when he does right. All right, and we'll find out on this story, but I think it might be helpful for you and I sometimes to admit that things are going slow in our lives as a result of our own foolish actions. And so for some of us, we might need to simply admit that we are where we are because of our foolish actions, admit it to ourselves, admit it to God, admit it to whoever cares to hear in our circle of influence, right? And that's the first step to being on our way to being where God would have us. You dig? Oh, that's the same as saying amen. So if I say you dig, just say I dig. You dig? All right. Point 2. God remains close to you even when personal, foolish actions put you in the dark waiting rooms. God remains close even when your personal, foolish actions put you in a waiting room. Man, that's great encouragement. You know, just so you know how bad things got for Mr. Joseph here, his brothers, who are supposed to be his protector, sell him into slavery. Immediately, Joseph is marched off to a different country. His father, who loves him so dearly, is told that his boy is dead. So get this, there's no search. There's no search party. All as a result of him being a little arrogant to his brothers. That is a lonely and scary place for a 17-year-old to be uprooted on your home, from your home, forcefully transported to another country. I mean, that's like some of you guys just being hijacked, put in a van, and waking up finding yourself in Malaysia as a slave. With no email, no phone, no way to contact home. And by the way, your parents aren't looking for you because they think you're dead. They found evidence that you're dead, so no one's looking for you. I mean, that's how scary this must have been for Joe. Now, at first, it's not all that bad for Joe. Actually, it is bad, but it doesn't end up that bad because when he comes out of slavery, guess what? He is purchased by a high-ranking Egyptian official to be a slave in that person's house. And Joseph actually rises up to a very important rank as a slave, right? So he's kind of made chief slave. In fact, Genesis 39, verse 2 tells us the secret to why Joseph excelled in the house of this Egyptian warlord, if you will. It says, here it is, 39, verse 2, Genesis says, the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in everything he did. So get this, even in the darkest position of slavery, God says, I'm still with you in there. I didn't forget you. I'm still with you. Now, things actually go pretty downhill pretty quickly, right? So get where Joseph has been. He has started as, daddy's favorite boy, to slave, to, I'm an important guy in Egyptian official's house. And then things go downhill pretty fast because his boss's wife can't keep her hands to herself. So Joseph ends up back in prison. He's back in prison again. But here's what's incredible. Verse 21 of Genesis 39 says, even in prison, the Lord was still with Joseph, and he showed Joseph kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison ward. And I think there's this sense where you and I feel like, and I know I felt this, that when right, we all, and I appreciate your honesty, we've all made dumb mistakes in our lives. Some of us, we haven't been caught yet, but for those of us who have been caught, right, we feel sometimes that I'm certain God has turned away from me, right? Because that's the way our human families act. When we do wrong, our families turn from us, right? And so we feel like, well, if I've crossed a line morally and I've offended, and the law punishes me or the authorities punish me, then that must mean God has abandoned me. But here's the fact. Here is one unmistakable, unshakable promise that God makes to every follower of Jesus Christ. And here it is. He says to you personally, I will never leave you and I will never forsake you. That verse is so simple and it's often quoted, but it is the most important verse that you should have. That means that even if you find yourself in the worst of situations that is clearly your fault, I mean, you are just clearly in the wrong. You have crossed a certain cultural, moral line you shouldn't, and you've messed up, and you know you've messed up. Scripture says, God says, yeah, I got you. I'm still with you. And even in your darkness, I'm still with you, man. That is great comfort. You know, I was thinking about this, and here's something to consider. Think about this. Do you know, how many of you guys have given your life to Jesus Christ? If you haven't, please be honest. Don't raise your hands. How many of you guys have given your life? You've put your faith in Jesus Christ. You've made it a personal decision. Okay, all right. Did you know that that God factored, and think about this, God factored in the fact that you would still sin after you came to faith in him, and he chose to save you anyway? Think about that for a second. Like, God wasn't in heaven saying, okay, if I save Mike, I know he's not going to mess up, so I'm going to save him. God saw every sin you would commit. Get this, God saw the sins that you haven't committed yet. And he says, you're still part of me. Or I like it this way. If there is no sin that's so great in your life that could keep God from saving you, then there's no sin that's so great in your life that'll keep God from loving you. You couldn't do anything bad enough to stop him from saving you. And when Jesus Christ forgives you on the cross, please keep in mind, he didn't forgive you for every sin you've committed in the past. He forgave you for every sin you've committed in the past, every sin you're committing. And get this, Jesus Christ forgives you for sins you haven't even committed yet. I think there's a reason why the Bible describes what Jesus did on the cross as the wonder of wonders. How is it that a God that's so much greater, so much bigger, so much more knowledgeable than us can choose to love us in spite of us? Wonder of wonders. Romans 8:28 says, and now we know that in all things God works for good for those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Here's what I want to say. Through faith in Jesus Christ, God guarantees that even when you screw up, you go as far, as dirty, as dark, that you never even thought possible, even in that place of darkness, Jesus still says, you're mine. It's incredible to me. And it's encouraging. God remains close to you in those dark places, but he doesn't leave us there. Point number 3, God uses dark, lonely waiting rooms, here it is, as character-building classrooms. It's character-building classrooms. Boy, man, your pain, your hardship, your difficult days are never a waste. God uses dark, lonely waiting rooms in your life as character-building classrooms. Now, let's talk through Joseph's life for a little bit. Let me just flesh it out for you, or at least let me invite you into a story. Once again, we'll flesh it out in coming weeks. But think about what Joseph had to go through, right? His brothers did this. I mean, I keep thinking about when his brothers are selling him to slavery and how much. Anyway, I don't want to give away too much of the fun stuff, but think about Joseph. If God were to suddenly bring Joseph out of prison and bring Joseph to a position of great influence and power and authority, and he could do anything he wanted, what do you think Joseph would have done to his brothers if he found them? Chop their heads off, right? I mean, think about what could have happened. Like, Joseph could have wiped out the entire nation of Israel, right? Because the entire nation of Israel comes from the 12 brothers, really, right? So think about how angry he might have been at his brothers if God had suddenly brought him out of that prison at that time. Let me make it more personal. I want you guys to think about your life. How would you react if you were given every opportunity to get back at somebody or a group of people who betrayed you, physically and emotionally abused you, caused you years of hardship and sorrow, and separated you from your family? How would you react to that person? Be honest. Don't give me the church answer. Don't answer, just think it. How would you react? Boy, if I'm honest, I got to tell you, I would very much be not like Joseph, as you'll find out in a little bit. I would get even. I still got some people that I think about from childhood that I'm like, man, if older me could go back there to younger me, I would beat the life out of that kid. I went through some fights in high school. You'll find out more about that, right? In the next message, we'll find out how God rescued Joseph from prison and made him the second wealthiest, most powerful, and influential man in the world. But get this, before Joseph went from dude next door to prime minister of the second greatest, to second most powerful man in the greatest nation of the world at the time, before he went through that, there were 13 years in between of waiting rooms. And during those 13 years, he spent some of them as a slave, he spent some of them in prison. And you know what I keep thinking? Were there days when Joseph was in prison where he thought to himself, what did I do, Lord? I don't get it. How long, right? How many of you guys have asked the how long question? I asked those questions a lot when I was in college. Lord, what am I going to do? When are you going to call me? When am I going to meet someone? We have all kinds of how long questions. Here's something to think about. In Joseph's life, those 13 years served as character-building classrooms because later on we'll find out that he had to learn to be compassionate. He did end up hooking back up with his brothers. And man, that's a dramatic account as he had to interact with them. He had every opportunity to get even with them, and we'll see how that happened, right? But it took 13 years in a dark, literally a dark room for him to really learn what character, for God to build in him the right kind of character to lead when he got to where he was going. So here it is. Sometimes, for some of you, the waiting room you're finding yourselves in right now is the destination. Let me say that again. Some of you guys are in a difficult season in your life, and you're wondering, God, when are you going to get me out of here? And I'm telling you that where you are very well right now is very well where God wants you to be. Not because he's a hateful, spiteful God or he wants you to suffer, but there's some things he's going to teach you in this season in your life that you would never learn if he took you to where you want him to take you. This is you acknowledging that sometimes you end up in some dumb places in your life because of your own dumb actions, right? There are some character qualities that you must learn in this current season in order for God to move you to the next season of your life. Otherwise, when you get there, you will make a huge mess of it. Let me tell you how it happened in my life. So one weekend, I ended up from America, heart of Africa. I arrived in boarding school in Nigeria. I went to a boarding school called Loyola College. By the way, when I say boarding school in Africa, I don't want you to think of it in terms of American preppy boarding school. I'm not even kidding, man. This place was a hellhole. They took me to the heart of rural Nigeria. First off, I had come from an American school in the city to an African boarding school, right? It's funny. I'm not even kidding when I say it was 50 to 100 times harder than anything I'd ever known. I went from a culture where we had running water on the tap, where we had electricity, to a rural school in the heartland of Africa where literally I had to take a machete and go out and cut grass. Forget lawnmowers, right? We didn't have vacuum cleaners, man. I had to use like literally broomsticks, and I don't mean the cute stick one. I mean like straws, right? I had to, this was a school where corporal punishment was allowed, not only by the principal, but by your seniors. I went to a school where, man, it was just bad, right? I've spoken to some of my peers recently who we both went to boarding school the same period over those 6 years, and they're all in the United States, most of them now. And we talk about our time in boarding school, and I think we all unanimously agree that being in boarding school during those 6 years is the closest that any of us will ever come to being in prison. It really was. I mean, we had uniforms and everything, and we had insecure seniors as our leaders, and so they beat the life out of us. I've taken some whooping in my day. But you know what? Those 6 years that I spent in boarding school in the heart of Nigeria, though it came as a result of my foolish actions, those 6 years were the most formative, most powerful, most spiritually powerful experiences of my life. I got to be honest with you, though they were some of the most difficult days of my life, I wouldn't trade them today if I could go back. Because I learned a number of things in boarding school. First of all, I became a Christian in my first year in boarding school. If you go to boarding school in Africa, you become a Christian because you need Jesus to survive. I'm not even joking with that. You should talk to my wife. You're going to need Jesus. I don't know how everybody without Jesus survived, but you need Jesus. I became a Christian in boarding school. I learned humor in boarding school. You go to this was an all-boys school. This wasn't co-ed. This was all-boys school. I learned humor in boarding school. I learned how to be funny in boarding school. I learned to pray and fast for myself. I remember the first time I fasted in boarding school, and of course, our motivation was food, right? We hadn't eaten the food they give you is just nonsense. And my friend of mine is like, we've seen our parents fast before, so why don't we fast and ask God, right? I've seen my mom do it before, so why don't we just skip, the meals for 3 days? Man, by day 3, you would have thought we were like a refugee camp. Me and him are like, but here's how bad we fasted. On the 3rd day, he and I are sitting by the kitchen during lunchtime, like, when are they going to serve lunch? We got to break this fast at 12 noon. But here's what's incredible. He and I fasted for 3 days, and our prayer was like, Lord, please send our parents to bring some extra money because we're broke, right? Because in boarding school, here's the other part. Your parents don't come visit you. You get one visit a year. It's just not that's the culture. I know you guys are thinking it's weird, but it's the culture. And we fasted, and about 2 days later, he and I are sitting in front of the main hall. I think it's the end of class, and we're just like, man, God, where are you? And I kid you not, my mom comes walking up. I don't know how God did it, but so first time I fasted in my life and prayed, and I'm like, ooh, God hears fasting and prayer. I need to make a list of what I need, right? Very powerful spiritual experience. I learned about spiritual warfare in Nigeria. Boy, I grew up in Africa where voodoo and, we talk about witchcraft here, and it's kind of a cute thing that people like to do because it's cool. In Africa, voodoo and evil is not some abstract, it is concrete. I mean, evil is the guy who lives next door who has a freaking calabash or some kind of gourd under his bed with like a dead chicken's head in it where he's putting together a spell upon you and your family. Like, evil is very real and present. There are people who carry curses. There are people who we would describe here as schizophrenic, who were so because somebody put a spell on them. So I learned about spiritual warfare in Africa. So spiritually, I was formed spiritually. I came to understand the power of Christ, the power of prayer, the power of Jesus Christ in the midst of darkness in Nigeria. I learned about confidence in boarding school. You got to learn that if you're in an all-boys school. I know this is not something to brag about, but I learned how to fight in boarding school. Oh, you're going to need that in boarding school when you're in a school with all boys. I learned how to defend myself in boarding school. I picked up so many life lessons and character qualities during some of the darkest, most hard, painful, lonely days of my life. And you know what? Once again, if I could go back, I wouldn't trade it. Those were, what I call those 6 years in boarding school in Nigeria? They were character-building classrooms. And I thank God for it. In fact, when I was done with high school and my parents sent me to the United States on my own, and that's why, when I came to the United States on my own and people were like, oh, dude, it's hardy. I'm like, no. I came to America, and I've been in this country on my own for the last 16 years. I came without my parents. I came with $20 in my pocket. And by God's grace, he was with me every time. But here's why I tell you that, not to brag about how much I've done on my own, but to say I had 6 years of school of hard knocks, and I learned to survive on my own. Now, some of you guys might not end up in the heart of Africa anytime soon, but you have your own version of a waiting room. And some of you guys want to get out now. And you're saying, God, I'm done with these painful seasons. I want out. And God's like, you got a little bit more work to do. Because where I'm taking you, man, there's some things I need to teach you now that you won't pick up when you get there. Are you with me on this? You dig? Okay. God is always working to prepare you for the next phase. Here's a phrase to remember at this point. No painful event in your life will ever go to waste. You know, right now you're in the middle of it and you're like, yeah, sure, you don't know how much I'm hurting. Trust me, you're going to look back on this season 10 years from now, 5 years from now, and be like, I am glad that the Lord put me through some of that because I'm a better man, I'm a better woman today. All right, point number 4, last one. Here it is. This is a good one. God will fulfill what he has determined to do in your life in spite of dark waiting rooms and foolish actions. God's going to fulfill what he's promised to do. And boy, I tell you, that's the greatest encouragement. I know some of us feel like, oh man, have I offended God so much he's left me? No, he hasn't. Here's what you need to know about Joseph. And once again, we'll conclude it in the series coming up. But the God-inspired dream that Joseph foolishly shared with his brothers early on in life, guess what? 13 years later, it came to pass. Every single detail to the description of what God said will happen came to pass in his life. In spite of the ups, and that's what you'll find about Joseph's life. He has ups and downs. I mean, how many of you guys, your week is like that? Like, I mean, you've just got ups and downs, right up. I mean, that was Joseph. And in spite of it all, God took him to where God said he would take him. The brothers and even the father ended up doing exactly what Joseph said they would do in his dream. Or what God said they would do to Joseph in his dream, which was a good thing for Joseph. So here's what you need to know, and this is the biggest thing, another big encouragement. Satan cannot thwart God's plan for your life. Oh, here's another one. You cannot thwart God's plan for your life. Only God can thwart God's plan for your life. And here's the deal. Romans chapter 11, verse 29, God has said, and I love this verse, Romans 11, 29, write it down. It says God's calling and God's gifting are irrevocable. Romans 11:29, which means God will not take back what he's given to you or what he's called you to. He's giving you a gift. He's giving you a calling. He's going to fulfill it. Now, you might do some dumb things that will cause you to be on a delay or a detour, but get this, you're not on your timeline. Right? We often think about our lives in terms of what is God going to do in my life and where is he going to take me? Here's the deal, and this is good for you to remember. You are part of a bigger story. You're part of a bigger story. Whether you realize it or not, there are people in, I keep using Malaysia, but that's because that's the easiest thing for me. There are people in Malaysia who someday will be impacted by something God is doing through you in New Jersey. God might cause you to write something or to build something or to influence somebody who will in turn influence somebody who will in turn influence somebody in Malaysia who will in turn do something great for God. And so get this, you are a part of a bigger story. And sometimes when your life seems to go through detours and you feel discouraged, remind yourself, number one, God has said he will never leave you or forsake you. God has said his gifting in your life and his calling in your life is irrevocable. He ain't going to take it back. He'll do something with it, right? Your foolish actions or inaction can result in a delay or a major detour, but understand that somehow, and this is huge, somehow in God's infinite wisdom, even your foolish mistakes and your detours and your delays, even those dumb things you do in your life that get you in trouble, somehow works together in God's plan so that you end up exactly where God wants you. And that's why he's God. He's able to redeem your dumbest behavioral foolishness for his glory and for your good, right? And that's why Romans says, 8:28-29 says, and we know that in all things, right, in all things, in everything God is doing in the world, God works all things together in your life, in the world, for good, together for good, for those who love him. Rest in the fact that God will bring to completion the good work he's began in your life. Amen?